Hi, how are we doing? Today we're going to talk about some more books. Specifically, we're going to talk about Michael J Sullivan's Legends of the First Empire series, a planned 6-book epic fantasy series that currently has 5 books out, but book 6 is coming out on May 5th, so maybe 6 books are already out by the time anyone watches this. I feel like I should be holding the books up right now for a nice little thumbnail image or something, but I don't actually have the books because I listen to the audiobooks. So we're just going to use the magic of editing to pretend that I am holding one up. So Legends of the First Empire, like I said, 6 books, but we're only talking about the first 3 because I've only read the first 3 and I don't think it would make much sense to talk about the first 5 and then leave the 6th one. I think it's much better to talk about in 2 halves. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, this is your classic epic fantasy setup. So think of your Tolkiens or your Dungeons and Dragons. We've got humans, we've got elves, we've got dwarves, we've got goblins. It's a lot of the classic races that most people are probably familiar with, even if you're not really a huge fantasy fan. So while this series is playing with mostly very established tropes that a vast majority of people are familiar with, there are a couple of things that it does a little bit differently. The first of those is the setting. So this series is actually a prequel to another series written by the author Michael J Sullivan called Rhaenyra. And Rhaenyra is actually one of my favorite fantasy series. I read it years ago. I love it. It's very dear to my heart. But it is not a prerequisite to read these books, nor are these books a prerequisite to read Rhaenyra. You can read either series in any order you want. But I'm going to try to avoid making comparisons because who the hell knows who's going to watch this video, right? Given that it is a prequel, and not only is it a prequel, it is a prequel set 3,000 years prior to the other series, there are a couple of things that make it stand out from a traditional fantasy story. And the biggest one, as you can imagine, is the time period. It's the setting. We're very used to seeing fantasy with knights in shining armor and steel weapons and horses and carriages and all kinds of other things that we all kind of take for granted. And those things are all present in Rhaenyra, which is the first series, and it's set in a very traditional fantasy setting, very intentionally so. But this series being set 3,000 years prior to that gets to do something that you don't really get to see very often in fantasy or any type of fiction, which is a Bronze Age setting. They don't really have steel in this series. They don't have a lot of things. The humans in particular don't have the wheel. They don't have the written word. They have like nothing. They're working with clay and that's about it. The elves, on the other hand, and the dwarves are both slightly more technologically advanced. As you can imagine, the dwarves are the most advanced technologically because it's kind of the trope we're used to, right? The dwarves are all smiths and stuff like that. But the elves have bronze weapons, and that's really where we're starting out in the series, in this Bronze Age setting. So the actual story revolves around conflict between the human race and the elves. Humans in this world kind of have it rough. They don't live very long. They don't have much tech. They're very much working with primitive technology. Elves, on the other hand, they live for a long time, around 3,000 years, which makes them functionally immortal from a human point of view. And what this has led to is that humans actually think the elves are gods. This all changes when a human named Wraith successfully kills one of the elves and throws the entire dynamic out of whack. That's not a spoiler, that is the hook of the series. That's the first chapter. You find out that this is a thing that happens. So obviously, even though the setting is a little bit different, this isn't exactly a revolutionary story. They're not trying to reinvent the wheel, even though they kind of are because they don't have it. But you get what I'm saying, right? This is playing with established tropes. It's fantasy for fantasy fans. With that said though, I think this is a very good execution of traditional fantasy. It's why I love the genre, is stories like this. Fantasy is like an old friend. No matter what happens, I can come back to it. And when it's done well, I'm just like, man, I miss you. I miss you so much. Specifically, what the series does really well is I think it does pacing very well. The setup and gradual payoff, the character arcs, everything about it is meticulously planned, and this is not without reason because Michael J Sullivan actually writes his entire series' prior to publishing any of the books. So all 6 books were written before book 1 was ever available. What that gives us is a series where nothing is really wasted. There's no meandering around, and there's no figuring out what to do next in this series. He knows what's going to happen. The characters do things that matter. The characters say things that matter. The story goes in directions that matter. It's very nice to see something like that in a fantasy landscape where authors like George R. R. Martin and Patrick Rothfuss are so infamous for doing the exact opposite of all of the things I just said. Specifically, the payoff in the 3rd book is excellent and really justifies everything that happens in the prior 2 books. I should mention that the setting I talked about, this Bronze Age setting, it's not just a gimmick, it's a key part of this plot, and it plays a role in a lot of the events of the story. You can imagine that a series where 2 races come into conflict and one of them has metal working and bronze weapons and the other one does not have metal of any kind, that's not really a balanced power dynamic. Also, and I can't believe I didn't mention this earlier, the elves have magic. They can like explode things and all kinds of other crazy stuff. And the humans are kind of just like, what? Gods? Gods. That's a god. That's gotta be a god, right? What is that if that's not a god? So again, that really plays into this whole underdog dynamic, which is still not something that most people are unfamiliar with, but it's nice to see that this technological aspect influences the story so much. You get to see how a society that is in this position would fight against a vastly superior force in terms of training, in terms of magic, and in terms of technology. They're gonna take an L unless they figure something out. So what are they going to do? The series does a good job of exploring that. The world building is another standout in my opinion. Michael J. Sullivan is really good at sort of creating intrigue within his world and drip feeding the audience with information without necessarily overloading the audience at any point. A lot of fantasy tends to fall into this trap of info dumping because authors put a lot of work into the worlds, and the worlds are a huge part of why I love fantasy. I love to get immersed in world building, but sometimes because the authors put so much work into it and because there's so much going on, it can almost feel like you're getting blasted with exposition to the point where the pacing of the story might even feel compromised at times. This series doesn't have that. Again, everything is very deliberate. And ironically enough, I think that the world is actually better for the fact that he doesn't burden us with too much information at any one point. What that allows the audience to feel is a sense of scale. It allows us to feel like this world is so much bigger than just the tiny slivers of it that we are being exposed to. Another thing about the world building that I really appreciate is that he goes into elfish society and explores the dynamics and interior politics, which is informed and influenced by the fact that they live so much longer than we do. It's a trope that we've all seen, and yet we usually see it from the outside in only. But here we are on the ground, on the inside, seeing how these things work and exploring aspects of the society that we normally wouldn't necessarily get to see, especially when you consider that they are effectively the antagonists because humans are going to root for the humans. I would very much like to see a series like this, except all the humans are actually the bad guys. Like, no, the humans, they gotta go. They gotta go. The last thing that I want to talk about that I like, because I like most of the things in this series, is the characters. The characters, much like the story in general, fall into certain pre-existing tropes. But I think that Michael J. Sullivan is very good at making the characters feel endearing and likable, and especially good at portraying relationships between people. I said I wouldn't talk about Rhaenyra too much, but Rhaenyra is carried entirely by the relationship between its 2 main protagonists, and you can definitely feel that energy in the relationships between most of the characters in the series. I wouldn't say that any of them match up to the Rhaenyra duo, because they are the 2 undisputed main characters of the 6 books that they lead. Actually, it's more than 6 now. But all of the relationships are lovely. Every group of characters has its own sort of dynamic, and all of them are entertaining and endearing. That being said, they are still leaning on tropes very heavily, and I know for a fact that a lot of people are just gonna roll their eyes at the fact that these characters are so tropey, but If you're okay with it, then I think you will very much enjoy these characters. I have two favorite characters in this series that I want to mention. The first one is a guy named Wraith who, did I mention his name earlier? I don't know. But he's the guy who actually kills the elf at the start of the book to set this story in motion. What's interesting about Wraith is that he's kind of an everyman, and that's not something you see very often in fantasy. He does do something extraordinary by killing an elf when a lot of people thought it was straight up impossible, but his actions are mostly the result of him being in the right place at the right time. He's not this godly warrior who is just murdering people left and right wherever he goes. He's not anything spectacular, really, which hurts to say about my boy, but that's kind of why he's my boy. And what that lets him be is this sort of grounding voice throughout the series. It lets him be the average guy, and I find that refreshing in a series that is so full of the extraordinary, in a genre that is so full of the extraordinary. We get to have a main character who is just not extraordinary, whose claim to fame is basically being in the right place at the right time. It feels like a strangely realistic take on the origins of myths. The second character I want to talk about is named Suri, and she's kind of the opposite of Wraith in a lot of ways. Wraith is very down to earth, he's very normal, and Suri is weird. She's just strange from a personality perspective, but in a really lovely and endearing way. Again, all these characters are a lot of fun to read. Suri's also the opposite of Wraith in another way. While Wraith stands out because he's kind of unspectacular, Suri is very much spectacular. The antagonists in the series are also great. In fact, I would say that the antagonists might even be better than the protagonists. Because while Michael J Sullivan is great at writing really likable protagonists, he is maybe better at writing absolutely detestable antagonists. I hate them so much. I want to do terrible things to some of these people, and I'm not proud of it. They just get me so heated. I do have to mention the main antagonist, Morndule, in particular, because he's the standout. He's just such a dipshit. I can't think of a better way to put it. He's just such a dipshit. He's naive, he's arrogant, he's narcissistic, he's condescending, he's dumb in just the right amounts to create a dipshit that is greater than the sum of his parts. Morndule is a guy I would not want to hang out with under any circumstances whatsoever. This series is also nice because it is a fantasy that does romance in a way that does not make me want the sweet release of death most of the time. So to sort of wrap things up about the pros, because there are some cons, this series is a lot of fun. It is fantasy for fantasy fans, but if you like fantasy, or at the very least don't dislike fantasy actively, I think you would have a blast reading these books. It's not just fun though. I should say that there are points at which you will get genuinely emotionally invested. You'll get the whole emotional spectrum provided you're down with fantasy for fantasy fans. That being said, we have some cons. The first con is actually one of the romances is one of the cons in my opinion. There's one in particular that I think the execution of was a little bit off. On paper, I think it's great because it makes the character arc stronger, especially for the man. It's just the execution of it I felt was a little bit hard to buy and could have been better. Another con is there is a subplot in the second book involving, how do I put this? Involving a javelin, and the character who is involved in this subplot does something that I feel is kind of out of character and a little bit tough to buy. Also, the second book does suffer from second book syndrome a little bit, and while it isn't the worst offender for this by any means, there are tons of second books that are a lot worse than this one, even in series that I really like. It does suffer a little bit. It's just not as good as the other two, and maybe could have been tightened a little bit. It is the longest one by a noticeable margin, so there's that. But all in all, this series is great. This is the type of series that is easy enough to read from a technical standpoint, and easy enough to follow from a narrative standpoint, that I think pretty much anyone could give this a go and come out enjoying it. There's really nothing that the series does poorly. If it sounds interesting, then there's a very good chance that you will find it interesting. So yeah, that's about it from me. I hope you're having a good one, and I'll see you later, maybe.